What I want to do is talk a little bit about the background to the book, and then probably what people are more interested in. You know, where are we now? What's the state of things? What's the outlook? So, okay. So the book, Return of Depression Economics and the Crisis of 2008, is kind of a longish title. The reason is it is a heavily revised and updated version of a book called The Return of Depression Economics, which I originally published in 1999. That book was inspired by the severe economic crisis that had swept through Asia in the late 1990s. It was what we thought was a severe economic crisis. It turns out it was nothing compared to what was to come, but it was certainly pretty bad for the countries afflicted. That crisis shook up a number of people, but not enough in the economics profession, because we'd all sort of taken the view that the Great Depression, the events of the Great Depression, were the result of real, complete lack of understanding. That we, if only our grandfathers had known what we know, that none of that would have happened, and that it was really easy to prevent a replay. But then in Asia, there were events that bore a distinct resemblance to what happened in the Great Depression. There were extreme financial crises in Korea, in Southeast Asia, that were highly reminiscent, if you knew your history, of what happened actually not so much in the United States as what happened to Austria in the Credit-Anstalt crisis in 1931, just generally, that things were remarkably depression-like in the way they played out. And in the case of Japan, which was, of course, a much bigger economy, what you had was not so much a severe crisis as a recession that they couldn't seem to get out of. What came to be known as the lost decade, although it was actually more like a lost 12 years, and in some ways, well, to a large extent, they're back in it again now. Some people looked at those events and said, well, it just shows how messed up the Asians are. But some people looked at them and said, you know, that could be us. In particular, you know, these were not countries run by stupid people. They knew modern macroeconomics. And in the case of Japan, in particular, you're looking at a country that, in a fundamental sense, looks a lot like us. Big, politically stable, you know, modern, advanced country with fairly sophisticated bureaucrats. You know, none of the obvious reasons it should go wrong. And if it could happen to Japan, it could happen to a lot of us. There was actually, Princeton was kind of a net, or a nest, I guess would be the word, of people who got very worried by the Japan example. Early years of this decade, there was a little group of people. Myself, Lars Svensson, who's currently on leave, gone back to work in his native Sweden at the central bank, trying to solve their problems. And the department head who actually hired me or persuaded me to come here, a guy by the name of, another one of those names I have trouble remembering, Ben Bernanke. We were all really kind of obsessed by the Japanese example and worried that something like that could happen to the United States, to Western Europe, and sure enough it did. Hence the 2008 update of the book, which was, the update was done in a white heat in late last fall, but I'm happy to say it, both happy and unhappy to say that it doesn't seem to have dated too badly, that if we'd had a rapid, dramatic recovery, or if the thing had turned out not to be largely a false alarm, it wouldn't look so good, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So what is this crisis that we've experienced? It is, I think the right way to think about it is that we basically replayed the first year of the Great Depression. Now the Great Depression, the vast slump was really 4 years. There was 4 years, one terrible year after another. What we did was, year one was a full match, pretty much. If you look at it globally, a full match for the Great Depression itself. World industrial production fell by about the same amount as it did from 1929 to 1930. World trade actually fell more than it did. Unemployment depends on which country you're looking at, but the United States unemployment rate rose by 5 percentage points, which is a lot, and broader measures of unemployment that take into account people who are involuntarily working part-time and so on, much more than that. So very, very severe. Tremendous amount of human damage done in this first year. The good news is that we do not appear to be replaying the second year of the Great Depression. So the plunge seems to have stopped. The short summary I've been giving of the current state of the world economy is apocalypse not now. We came up to the edge of the abyss. We've stepped back a pace or two from the edge of the abyss, which does not mean that things are okay, very far from it, but it means that at the moment it does look like Great Depression 2.0 is not about to happen. But even so, that's very serious, and there are, as I'll say in a few minutes, there are real problems about how do we actually recover as opposed to simply avoiding utter catastrophe. So how did this happen? Well, obviously that's a story that will be the subject of endless analysis over generations to come. But here's what we know so far. Approximately what we had was we had the mother of all asset bubbles in housing. Probably the biggest mispricing, overvaluation of assets in history, not just in the United States. There's the U.S. Real estate bubble, which was extreme, severe, particularly in coastal regions, particularly in coastal Florida and in Southern California and a few other regions, but fair bit here as well. But also comparable or even bigger housing bubbles in coastal Spain, in a good part of Britain, in Ireland, and combined sort of real estate and capital inflow bubbles in a lot of Eastern Europe, where people just got wildly enthused with the prospects of the emerging economies of Eastern Europe and poured money in, completely heedless of the possible consequences. And then, of course, some very special issues in places. Well, Ireland and Iceland have got, they're really got caught up in this even more than anyone else. When the bubbles burst, by the way, just sorry, second. I still remain amazed that how few people called those bubbles. I thought, as did everyone else who was, I was talking to, that was the clearest mispricing, the clearest craziness that I've ever seen in my life. They were, just by the numbers, housing prices were way out of line, and there were all of the sort of telltale cultural things that tell you things are going wrong. You knew that back in the late 90s, you knew that stocks, that something terrible was going to happen to stocks when you would go into a greasy pizza joint, and instead of having sports on the TV up there in the corner, they'd have CNBC. You knew that the housing thing was really too far gone when you were starting to have, there was actually a TV show called Flip This House, right? There was clearly an obsession with rising real estate values that was all of the harbingers of this going wrong. But conventional wisdom was that it all made perfectly good sense. And so the bubble burst, as bubbles will. And when it did, it brought down a large part of the financial system with it. And that's what turned what was sure to have been a nasty recession into something which was much, much worse than that. If we step back a little bit and ask, well, why were the consequences of, actually, to some extent, how did the bubble inflate so far? And even more important, why were the consequences so bad? Then you have to talk about an out-of-control financial system. And that, I have to say, a few people saw that. I was not one of them. I did not understand how far gone we were. The key thing really here is a combination of deregulation and failure to extend regulation to keep up with the expansion with the complexity of the system. So deregulation, there were a couple of major changes in the way banks were regulated in the early 1980s. Really, one bill in 1980, one in 1982, that made it. There's a lot of things that happened. The 1982 bill, Garn St. Germain, very directly led to the savings and loan explosion and collapse later in that decade. But more broadly, it led to banks lending with a lot less collateral, a lot less security. And one of the things you can see happening right there is that U.S. households began running up debt. I got a little annoyed with my colleague David Brooks at the Times, who wrote something which is mostly true, saying around 1980 there seems to be a change in American values. We started as a nation getting deeper and deeper into debt, whereas before we'd been fairly careful about it. And it's true, there is a real break, and you can see that debt changes, but it wasn't a change in morals. It was Ronald Reagan, basically. It was a change in regulations and you can see that the break is right there. But what turned out to be even more important in the crisis was that we continued to have fairly good protections for things that looked like the original version of what a bank looks like. If everybody's seen It's a Wonderful Life, the movie, and the bank run scene in the movie, which is supposed to be taking place just after World War II. And while it's a great scene, it could not actually have happened, because by that time, just after World War II, in fact, bank deposits were insured, so people would not have panicked over the state of the bank. So it was a 1933 scene set in 1947. Basically, it couldn't actually have happened. And at the same time, as the counterpart of having deposits insured, banks were pretty tightly regulated in what they could do, so they couldn't take lots of risks and then taxpayers finding themselves on the hook. We continued to think that although maybe the banks were allowed to take bigger risks, well, the banks were protected. We had deposit insurance. We had more subtle things. Banks have access to the discount window, so they can borrow cash in need, and so on. What almost everybody, myself included, failed to think about was that something doesn't have to look like a bank to be a bank in economic terms. It doesn't have to be a big marble building with a row of tellers. Basically, anybody who borrows short and lends long, anybody who offers people ready access to their cash, but actually puts most of that cash in investments that can't be liquidated on a moment's notice, is a bank. And we had this proliferation of banking-type arrangements that were not officially banks. The list goes on, but the things like, my favorite, although it's not the most important, was auction rate securities, which is an arrangement that was used to finance a lot of stuff, used to finance expansion plans at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, among other things, which was an arrangement that supposedly financed long-term investments, but every week or every 2 weeks, depending on the structure, you had a chance to get your money out, because there was an auction held in which you would get a chance to sell your share to someone else, and there was no chance that the auction would fail. We were assured of that, until, of course, in 2008 they all failed. The entire sector collapsed, and essentially a $350 billion piece of the banking system just disappeared. A lot of long-term investments were being financed in the repo market, which is overnight borrowing. Again, that's banking. People thought, well, it's a repo. I've got, my cash comes back to me tomorrow. But it was long-term investments that were being financed by that. And when people actually sort of locate the point where the break took place in the fault, it is the repo market, and it was effectively a bank run. But it didn't look like a modern bank. It didn't look like a 1930s bank run with lines of people outside the bank pounding on the doors. It was all being conducted basically in cyberspace. But the economic consequences were the same. And so what we had, I should use the term shadow banking system. The shadow banking system was bigger by total amount of assets, total amount of financing. By 2007, the shadow banking system was bigger than the conventional banking system, and almost completely unregulated, almost completely unprotected. And so when the housing bubbles in various parts of the world burst, we had basically the 21st century version of the bank runs of the early 1930s. collapse of banking system, terrible things happened, disaster. Okay, but as I said, apocalypse not now. What we've had is this horrible, huge blow to the world economy, huge amount of human suffering. Everybody I know, myself included, has friends, relatives who lost jobs, whose lives have been upended by the crisis. It's a very broadly based harm, but not the Great Depression, not so far at least 25% unemployment and armies of people on the roads trying desperately to find work. It hasn't been that bad. Why was that? I think it's a couple of things put together. One is we were to a certain extent inoculated against the Second Great Depression by the fact that we'd had the First Great Depression. People were aware that this could happen. And in particular, people in positions at central banks, the people who control the money supplies, were aware. And particularly the former Princeton professor running the Federal Reserve, I think we can say that Ben was slow on the uptake, realizing how precarious the situation was, as was almost everybody in authority. But when things started to break in early 2008, he said, this could be it. This could be the big one, and moved very aggressively. So where the Fed in 1930 was reluctant to extend cash to banks in trouble, reluctant to act, the Fed in 2008, 2009 has been, throw money, rush the fire brigade over there to put out the fire, and we'll worry about the details later. And to a lesser extent, that's been true around the world. So very aggressive policies, rushing in, extremely unconventional policies. What's interesting is actually some of the Bernanke academic papers about what to do in a Japan-type situation have actually been the template for U.S. policy in this crisis. So they've actually been, to some extent, we've been marching down Ben Bernanke's CV. We tried his 2002 paper. That helped, but wasn't enough. We tried his 2003 paper. That helped a little bit more. And so, okay. The second thing that helped is big government. And in this case, quite literally, just the fact that governments are much bigger than they were in 1929 has helped. Because even as the economies have dropped and wages have fallen and people have taken huge capital losses and become reluctant to spend, the Social Security checks are still going out. The Medicare is still paying hospital bills. To some extent, although not enough, states and local governments are still paying school teachers, although they've been forced to make some totally unwarranted, totally unjustifiable, but unavoidable given their state of being, cutbacks. Basically, we talk in the jargon of economics about automatic stabilizers and that come from the existence of a fairly big government. And that's what we've had. We've had automatic stabilizers. There was a great comment. There's a blog by Stan Collender at National Journal, who's a very he's an extremely moderate person, if you can say that. And he just had a comment about the budget deficit, which for the last fiscal year, where fiscal years run from October 1st to September 30th, and I don't know why. But anyway, so the U.S. government had a budget deficit of $1.4 trillion this past fiscal year. Stan said, correctly, that deficit is a triumph of policy. If we had not run that deficit, we would have had probably Great Depression too. And so it's not something we can do year after year after year, but running that what right now is a good thing. I've said basically deficits saved the world this time around, which doesn't mean that they're always good, that they're sustainable indefinitely, but they helped. Third thing is there has been some deliberate attempt to create jobs, the stimulus plans, which have helped. They're not huge relative to the scale of the problem. You always have to get some sense. So the Obama stimulus plan probably has we probably have up north of 1 million more people working in America because of that plan than we would have otherwise, which is good, but we're about 8 million jobs down from where we were before, and if you count the people who should have been, the growth in employment we should have had, we're probably 9.5 million jobs down. So it's made a dent in the problem, but it's not not enough to come where we were close to curing it. All right, so we stepped back from the edge of the abyss. That now is when it actually gets hard, because what happens at this point is, how do you recover from something like this? How do you go beyond just, with unemployment? Maybe, if we're lucky, a few months from now we'll stop losing jobs. But how do we start getting those jobs back? How do you actually get back all of this ground that we've lost? There are a few things we know from history. And one thing I would say is actually people have been doing a lot of looking at history to try and figure out what's going on, because as you might figure, the econometric models did not work here. So we're actually back to looking at historical precedents a lot to try and figure out. When you have a recession that's the result of a financial crisis, they tends to be a long time before you get a full recovery, often 5 years or more. When you have a recession that leaves people with troubled balance sheets, with too much debt and not enough assets, those tend to be very hard to recover from. That's Japan, their lost decade. In their case, it was corporations that had completely messed up balance sheets. In our case, it's households. That's hard to recover from. The IMF had a big survey of past crises and recoveries, and found that basically financial crises are recessions that are a result of financial crises are very highly persistent. They're more persistent if they happen in a number of countries at once. Of course, this one has happened everywhere. And one more thing they discovered is that the route to recovery when countries do bounce back has almost invariably involved countries moving into big trade surpluses. You tend to have these export-led recoveries, so that when the Asian economies that had their crisis in the late 90s, they came roaring back eventually. They did it by running huge trade surpluses, selling a lot of stuff largely to us, which boosted them out. When Argentina had its terrible crisis in 2002, it came bouncing back with a big trade surplus. Even Japan, when they finally, maybe temporarily, exited their lost decade, a big trade surplus was the big thing driving the recovery. This time we've got a global financial crisis, or a global recession caused by a financial crisis. And unless we can find another planet to export to, we can't all run trade surpluses. So we've got this, and you ask, where's the precedent of a global financial crisis and recovery from that, full recovery? What are the precedents? And the answer is actually there's just one, which is the Great Depression itself. And that was ended by a large public spending program known as World War II, which is not particularly, actually, first of all, not something we're likely to emulate, not something we want to emulate, in any case, not something we're likely to emulate, because absent a war, you never can persuade the political process to spend that much money on recovery. Okay, just one thing to mention briefly, because if it comes up, and it's something we have one sort of additional problem, that whole trade surplus, where does recovery come from, which is that we have one fairly big player which seems determined to continue running a trade surplus, even though it really shouldn't be, and we're going to have I think a major confrontation in the not too distant future, and that's China. So China is actually looking like a major stumbling point in getting this recovery going, if we really can. The last thing to say, on recovery is the intellectual problems that we have facing, trying to get this thing going. It is really hard to get people to wrap their minds around just how different things are from normal right now. That this is a time. How do I explain this? The core thing, from an economist's point of view, I guess, is that the core thing right now is that we are in what, another piece of impenetrable jargon, we're in a liquidity trap, which means basically that the Federal Reserve, which normally is what takes care of engineering recoveries, it does that by pushing down short-term interest rates on government debt. Those interest rates are zero right now. 0.066 last I looked, anyway, but zero, essentially. Now, actually, we can look historically at how the Fed has tended to set interest rates. By looking at unemployment and inflation, you get a pretty good picture of you can track the Fed's past decision right now. And if you apply that rule to where we are right now, it says that the interest rate ought to be minus 5.6%. So obviously, they cannot push interest rates as low as they'd like them, which is why all the other stuff. When you're in that kind of situation, it becomes kind of an Alice through the looking glass world economically. It's a world in which saving, we like to have people save, except please not now. This is a bad thing. In which government deficits, which are normally a bad thing, are actually a good thing. In which trying to apply normal rules of prudence is a really bad, can actually be a extremely foolish thing to do. Very hard to explain that. It's very hard to explain it to Congress, I guess I should say. It's very hard to explain it to editorial pages, my own accepted. It's not hard to explain it actually to the administration or to the Fed. After all these years, having spent almost my entire op-ed writer career under Bush, it is totally disorienting and weird to have a phone conversation with senior people in the administration and discover that they are actually making sense. But that's the point is that a lot of these things require, if we're going to do what needs to be done, requires legislation, and it's very, very hard to do that. So we ended up with a stimulus plan that was lowballed, was much smaller than I thought it needed to be, and actually. If you read, there was a profile of Larry Summers in the New Yorker, which had a lot of ancillary information, and one of the things that comes clear from it is that Christina Romer, who's the head of the Council of Economic Advisors now, that her spreadsheet looked just like my spreadsheet. She basically had came out with the same numbers, and thought it really should have been a $1.3 trillion stimulus, which obviously didn't happen. So these things are too small, and it's very difficult to get continuing, particularly as if this thing drags on, which I fear it will, to get the political consensus to do what needs to be done to actually produce a solid recovery is going to be really hard. I'm not worried about Great Depression 2 now. I think we managed to steer clear of that. I am very much worried about a Japanese-style lost decade, with this difference that actually we already have much, much higher unemployment than the Japanese ever did during their lost decade. So the human toll is actually much greater now than it ever was for them, but that we could end up just sort of having technically a recovery, GDP growing, but unemployment falls a bit and then rises a bit and just bounces along at an alarmingly high level for a very long time. So this is going to be tough, and it's going to be much harder because the prospect of imminent disaster focuses minds. The prospect of a prolonged stagnation does not, and so it's going to be tough. But what can you say? We have, the world did not end this year. Which is always a good thing, and at least at the top, we have pretty intelligent people who are I disagree with on some things. It turns out I didn't even mention bank reform, but I'll leave that. But it's going to be a long, long slog. Unless something that is not at all visible on the horizon turns up, this crisis, in the broad sense, is going to drag on for years. We're going to be living in a world of depression economics, in the sense in which I'm in that book, for a long time to come. And with that happy thought, so the question is, what we have is 2 mics at the back, and what people should do is line up at the mics, and I'll just try to alternate as I call on people, I think. And the usual ground rules: questions should actually be questions, not speeches. And I will answer on any subject whatsoever. The Times has turned me into has given me the ability to fake expertise on a wide range of topics. Okay, let's start on that end.
Thank you for the opportunity. 2 questions. Isn't it government regulation that caused this mess? As an example, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac being forced to make loans that they shouldn't have, and then Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac passes it off to the financial community, and they took advantage of it. The second question is, isn't Geithner trying to reduce our debt to China, and China seems to be backing away from our debt now, by causing inflation? And isn't the risk to that hyperinflation, which is reminiscent of Germany when people carried a briefcase full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread?
Okay. So I'm glad, actually, to have both those questions. The government side, so Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are the government-sponsored housing lending agencies. Started out as just a government lending agency, but they were semi-privatized some, 40 years ago. And a favorite trope is to say, well, they're responsible for the crisis. If you actually look at it, here's the story. Until quite late in the game, Fannie and Freddie did not do subprime lending. They were, the definition of prime, actually, a prime loan is one that qualifies for Fannie and Freddie financing under the normal criteria. In the late 90s, early years of this decade, private lenders began rushing into these new subprime loans. And after several years of watching their market share drop, Fannie and Freddie began to follow. But the great bulk of the bad lending that has taken place actually is from private sector lenders. Very little of it from Fannie and Freddie. And by the way, the Fannie and Freddie stuff, the loans that got sliced and diced and turned into these fancy securities that nobody understood, those don't come from Fannie and Freddie. Those are the ones that the private sector lenders created. So Fannie and Freddie are not blameless, but they really are followers in this crisis, not leaders. If you really want to think about the kind of institution that made the loans that made things go crazy, you want to think of something like Countrywide Financial rather than Fannie and Freddie. On the inflation, I think the way to say this is, well, a couple of things. One is there's no inflation on the horizon. There's not a hint of it visible in the data. Actually, all of the inflation numbers suggest that we're experiencing disinflation, not yet deflation, but all the numbers are falling as we go along. People say, well, the Fed has printed a lot of money. Surely that will be inflationary. But that's where you really need to, what I said about the Alice through the looking glass world, this is a situation in which the normal rules do not at all apply. When the interest rate is basically zero, what happens when the Fed prints money normally? It's actually going out there and buying short-term government debt and basically creating bank reserves in return. Normally that matters because it's replacing an interest-bearing asset with a zero-interest asset, which is more liquid. These days, with interest rate zero, the stuff just sits there. So and we have experience in this. The Japanese had a policy which they called quantitative easing, which has unfortunately been taken to describe what the Fed is doing right now, not a very good parallel. They just printed lots and lots of money starting in 1998. So they almost doubled the monetary base, the sum of bank reserves and cash in circulation. And what that doubling did was nothing. Deflation continued in Japan. What happened was there was a lot of monetary base floating around there. Banks had lots more reserves. They didn't want to lend them out. Japanese economists, I was told by one that there was only one consumer durable that was selling well, which was safes. So that it just was sterilized. And we actually had the same experience in the 30s when there was a huge increase in the monetary base during the 30s and nothing happened. If we look at what's actually happening now, it's even more complicated because a lot of what we're calling monetary base is excess reserves that banks are holding at the Fed. The Fed is now paying interest on those. So that's actually just government borrowing. It's not actually money printing. So there's no hint. I mean, I wish we could have a little bit of inflation, which would grease the wheels here, but actually no sign of it. What we actually have is a situation where I actually fear deflation, as do a fair number of economists. The majority opinion is that we'll steer clear of that. If we look at, there are markets. People can buy U.S. Government debt that's inflation protected, and you can look at the spread as an indication of inflation. What the market expects is an average of 1.5% inflation over the next 5 years, 2% inflation over the next 10 years. 2% is the Fed's target. So the market thinks everything's under control. I think it's actually a little out of control on the downside, but there's not a hint there. I wish Geithner would be a little I think he's too solicitous of worrying about what the Chinese think. I think if the Chinese want to go dump dollars, be my guest. It will actually it would weaken the U.S. dollar, but that would actually help our exports. And I guess it's because inflation is not a problem. I don't think that's an issue we should be worrying about right now. It would be different again if we were at full employment and all of that, but we're not. So it's I don't think that's an issue. And there is, I will say, there's this urge to find. Markets are perfect, so government must be the villain here. And you find that all the time. And I get all kinds of interesting mail about who the true villains were. I just got one that said that all of this is the fault of Henry Cisneros, who was HUD. I barely remember, but something about forcing banks to make loans to people who couldn't handle them. But if you actually look. Almost all of the lending was the bad lending was private sector. The great bulk of it was by unregulated private sector, not even by banks that were subject to community lending, whatever, but by things like Countrywide that were completely outside the loop. So no, this was the private sector did this on its own without help from the government. Sorry, yeah.
Regulatory reform. Are the banks still gambling with taxpayers' money? And if so, how long is it going to take, and what do we have to do as citizens to get the regulations that should have been enforced before?
Yeah. Yes, the banks are still actually more than before. So that if you take a look at Goldman Sachs, before the crisis, Goldman was just an investment bank with no government guarantee, and I think even implicitly people didn't really think about it as having government backing. But now it is actually, it has some government guaranteed debt. It has implicitly everybody, before the crisis, I think people said, well, if an investment bank, not a regular bank fails, well, that's, that happens, and this is not a public responsibility. But we tried the experiment by letting Lehman fail, and the world almost ended that week. So now everybody knows that any highly connected financial institution has an implicit government floor under it. And so and the answer to that, we did that with the commercial banks, regular banks in the 30s. The answer is guarantee but regulate. Is it going to happen? Not looking good right now. For what it's worth, the white paper pushed on reform that the administration put out back in the spring is not bad. You can argue with a lot of it, but the combination of calls for extra supervision, capital requirements of what it calls systemically important institutions, the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, all of that would at least make a pretty good start on reform. The legislation is just, the attempt to get to actual legislation has bogged down because the banks, now that they're doing a little bit better, are lobbying furiously against it. And I'm not totally without hope here, but I'm not too optimistic. So we're in trouble. This crisis may go to waste, and we may actually end up well positioned to have an even bigger one another 10 years down the road.
The unemployment rate, you're talking about 6, 7 jobs, applicants per one job. Used to be 1.7 before the crisis. Having 7 per one looks like that the free enterprise system will not be able to take care of that, at least not very soon. Therefore, collective actions is necessary. Now, it seems to be that in the United States, there is no interest in the common good. Is it the economics, the European economies, some more political economies which are concerned with the common goods, like the London School of Economics, Lasky used to be in that direction. Is there something to it?
Oh, I think we've spent the last 30 years, especially in the United States, but not only in the United States, under the spell of an ideology. Basically, Gordon Gekko won. If you watch Wall Street, greed is good. That letting the free market be untrammeled is what works. And part of that was a probably necessary reaction. There was a point in our history when there was too much belief that the government should dictate. That certainly on some things we learned environmental policy can work a lot better if you use the market, not rely on it exclusively, but use it, for example. But we got into this belief that markets are always right. And we forgot what our grandfathers knew about particularly financial markets being useful but extremely dangerous and needing to be closely watched. Are Americans worse, less common good oriented than the rest? I'm not sure that's, I think what is striking about this crisis is actually the extent to which everybody got caught up in it. That the Europeans had their own version of the bubbles and the financial bust that was every bit as bad as ours. That if you want to look at countries that really bought into we trust markets, greed is good, nothing can possibly go wrong, the maximorum or whatever is Iceland of all places. So, this was I would almost, there are lots of things going on here, but a lot of it was just there was an intellectual virus that we all caught and led us to this point. And maybe in some larger sense it was inevitable that once we got to the third generation since the Great Depression, we would have forgotten the lessons of the Depression and have to do it all over again. Yeah.
You mentioned that this crisis snuck up on us a little bit, even people who are well-versed in this thing, with the shadow banking system. All these toxic assets, these derivative products, these arcane things, are still on the books of a lot of these big financial companies, and they're still completely opaque. What would you recommend we do? What kind of policy should we do to shed some light on the shadow banking system so we could at least see who's fooling us still and who's actually got some growth going on in their company?
Yeah. So what I would have done, what I still would like to do is impose regulatory requirements on financial institutions that look like they might pose a risk to the system, that are flexible, that are principles-based, as people say, rather than rules-based. So, and that was actually kind of what's in the probably not operative, but still not a bad document, the white paper from the Treasury, which said they're going to define what they call Tier 1 financial institutions, which are the ones that really need to be tightly regulated. And the definition of a Tier 1 financial institution is kind of like the definition of pornography. We'll know it when we see it. We'll say, okay, you, and you. You may not look like a commercial bank, but for all practical purposes, you are doing it and you are big, and we know that we'll have to bail you out if you fail. So we're going to impose a lot of capital requirements, liquidity requirements on you. My belief is that that would cause the shadow banking system to shrink dramatically, because a lot of what it was about was regulatory evasion. It was about finding complicated ways to do things, because that way, by the letter of the rules, the way they were written, you weren't subject to the requirements. So I think that would shrink it. The legacy of stuff behind us, that's a real problem. I mean, there was this question, how do we, particularly now that we've got these big financial institutions, which are partly traditional bank, partly shadow banking, and deeply troubled, how do we get them back to being financially sound enough to get them functioning? How do we take the bad assets off their books, and people say, how do we get the toxic waste off their books? But that's really a problem, because getting the toxic waste off the books is easy. You just write it down to zero. The problem is, how do you get the toxic waste off the books while not destroying their solvency? And the only route that we really know, there were really basically two strategies that were proposed. One was to have the taxpayer put up a lot of capital for these institutions, but there was really no way to do that without effectively taking public ownership, at least temporarily. The other was to sort of stand back and hope for that they can earn their way back to financial health, which was looking okay for about 6 months. Basically, that is the administration strategy, but it's not looking so good right now. So right now, you look, and Goldman, of course, is making enormous profits, but Citigroup and Bank of America, which were the two that everybody was, of the major institutions, those were the two that were on the possible nationalization list. They were actually losing money again. So we're not doing too well. I don't know whether we'll muddle through for a while, and maybe we'll revisit that whole discussion a year or two from now. One funny thing, in the discussion about what to do, and people looked at the Swedish model, because Sweden basically, they guaranteed the debt of all the banks and then nationalized the weakest of them. And the argument was that, well, that's very different. America has lots of banks. Sweden has, I think the president actually said, Sweden has like 4 banks. Well, in terms of the big financial institutions right now, we have Citi, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan, and I'm having a senior moment here, but we basically have 4 banks. So we're actually down to that state. But at this point, you can't do it. At this point, politically, the will isn't there. The stocks are too valuable. So we hold and hope that with a limping financial system, we can still have a full recovery.
So you described a scenario where we've come right up to the edge of the abyss, but in some ways we're spared from going over the abyss by deficit spending and by a stimulus package that produced jobs. And that prevented us from going over the abyss, and then we sort of fast forward to the present, and just a few days ago there were 3 articles in the paper, almost side by side, one of which said that despite the job program, the unemployment situation is still horrible, and number 2, that the deficit is now at a state where similar to where it hadn't been since the 1940s, and number 3, that the governments from abroad are becoming less interested in financing our debt. So it seems to this non-expert that the 3 strategies that one could use to save ourselves from going over the abyss are not available anymore. So is there anything you can say to reassure the non-experts that we're in fact not about to go over the abyss?
Yeah. Deficit financing fears are grossly exaggerated at this point. I mean, when you've got a country that's able to borrow long-term at 3.4% interest rate, which is where we are now, that's not a country that's having difficulty financing itself. There are limits to how deep into debt even America can go, but we're nowhere close to those limits right now. There's this kind of will to believe that deficits are a big problem. That leads to some really kind of strange reporting. So I got annoyed at an article in the Times this morning about Japan. You may have seen it, big thing about Japan, and it said that investors are jittery about Japan's debt and deficits, and said that fears of a glut of bond issuance by the Japanese government have pushed the yield on government debt to its highest level in 6 weeks, which was true, but somehow the article never mentioned what the interest rate on 10-year Japanese government bonds has been pushed up to recently. And the answer is actually 1.36%. So, it's a country that can borrow for 10 years at 1.36% is not close to the edge fiscally. And I think that's the general picture. There are a few countries. Iceland can't borrow anymore. Ireland probably can't because its banking problems are just too big relative to the size of the economy. But not. We've got a fair amount of room for maneuver. We need to use it. The big Japanese problem in the 90s was that they dribbled out their efforts. They would do a wave of stimulus spending, and then the economy would improve a little bit, and they'd say, okay, we're going to start tightening our belt, and they'd slide back down again, which is also, by the way, what the United States did in the 1930s. So the problem, we're not getting our act together to do a really decisive recovery strategy. Yeah. I'll take about 4 more, I think.
So I know you mentioned China is a source of conflict in the future in terms of economic policy, and I know Chairman Bernanke mentioned, I think, that the export, the artificial export-based economy leads to somewhat of a misallocation of resources. So the question is, will there be some sort of long-run equilibrium where China gets off the fixed rate, or if not, how do we deal with China?
Yeah. By the way, Chairman Bernanke gave a speech on Monday about global imbalances that was wonderful because it was in Fed speak. Chairman of the Fed, I think it turns out this really is necessary. They talk in code, right? Everything, reading them or listening, it's like, if you saw my blog, I did use this analogy already. It's like the scene in Annie Hall, where Woody Allen and Diane Keaton are talking, but there are also subtitles about what they're really saying. So there's this marvelously elliptical phrase about some developing economies which may have taken the lessons of the 90s too much to heart, what he's actually saying is, okay, China is really off the reservation here, and Beijing, we got a problem. But it doesn't say anything like that in so many words. This is a problem. I mean, one way to look at this is the United States, the dollar is falling. The dollar has fallen about 10% against the yen and 15% against the euro, which all makes sense and is perfectly reasonable because we have a trade deficit. We need to become more competitive. The dollar was temporarily boosted by safe haven. People were rushing into dollars because the world was scary and the U.S. is still the last safe place. But now that things have calmed down a bit, the money's going out. That all makes sense. But the Chinese yuan has also depreciated 10% against the yen and 15% against the euro, which makes no sense at all. China is a trade surplus country. This is fundamentally crazy, but they're staying pegged to the dollar, and it's being done by having them buy up huge quantities of dollar assets. It's actually exactly how it plays out, I don't know, but we actually have an annual process where the Treasury Department has to certify to Congress that China is not manipulating its currency. And every year Treasury lies and says China is not manipulating its currency, and they kind of hedged it this year. It was they more or less said that, but in a way that made it clear, in a way that they haven't before, that we don't really believe this. Enormous pressure can be brought by saying, actually they are manipulating their currency. It's a little bit of brinksmanship because what happens next if the Chinese don't do something is that the U.S. Congress and probably the European Union as well start to impose trade sanctions on China, which is a very dangerous game. But at some point you have to say, well, if if they don't listen, we have to start playing a little bit of brinksmanship. As I said, I don't think the consequences if the Chinese start dumping dollars are nearly as bad for us as people think. So I think they're actually favorable. But yeah, this is going to come. There's going to be some really tough negotiation. I don't think the Chinese are ready to have a free floating exchange rate. You can't do that without a completely unrestricted convertible currency. And you can't have that unless you have a really solid banking system, which they don't. So it probably has to be a deliberate policy. They just have to say, okay, we're going to raise the value of our currency by 20 or 25%. They don't want to do it, but one way or another, it's going to happen. The only question is how ugly the route to getting there it turns out to be. Okay, 3 more. One there.
Thank you. What are your thoughts about the U.S. automobile industry and about the future of the big 3?
Oh, boy.
Thank you.
This is where I really don't know. I mean, this is obviously nobody can be confident that they're going to make it. I say 50% odds that something of the big 3 will survive. But that's based on nothing. That's based on what one of my old professors used to call the principle of insignificant reason. The bailout was worth doing just because of the option value. You didn't want to, for sure, see that industry go under when it might possibly survive. Even if the big 3 do go under, we will still have an auto industry here. A lot of the U.S. auto industry is now transplants. Is auto, most of it not in the inner Midwest, but instead sort of spread down towards the Southeast, and that'll still be there. But yeah, this is you do what you can, but no way of guaranteeing salvation. Of course, the fall in the dollar will help. Weaker dollar will actually make it a little easier for the auto industry to survive. So these are, and of course, a real economic recovery would help a lot too. Yeah.
I just want to know your opinion of the recent kind of explosive growth of the financial industry. Do you think it's more of a step towards efficient allocation of capital, or more of a drain of very smart, talented people away from other industries?
Yeah, I'm with the parasite view of finance. I mean, a banking sector is a good thing to have, but we had this huge increase. We had, particularly if you look at the fancy banking, basically, the line in the national accounts that's securities, investments, and something or other. That was 0.3% of GDP in 1980, and around 1.7, 1.8 on the eve of the crisis. What were we getting out of that? Were we getting a lot of really good allocation of capital to the most valuable uses? Think about the housing bubble, and it's kind of hard to believe that. There's almost a parlor game that we have here, which is people talk about the value of financial innovation. The parlor game is name an unambiguously beneficial financial innovation in the last 30 years, and you're not allowed to count ATMs. Okay? And basically nobody can come up with one, right? So it's not at all clear that. So I think this really was a bad thing, that we pulled a lot of the nation's talent into, smartest guys into an industry that was basically collecting rents, not actually being productive. And in fact, there's even a theory. Actually, there was Calvin Trillin had this something in the Times about that. In fact, the really big problem was that smart people started to go into banking. That as long as it was these sort of not too bright young men from good families who went in and basically just kept on doing things the way Daddy did it, then we didn't have these problems. And it was the influx of all of these bright Princeton grads that really did it. And there's something to be said for that view. Last.
What do you think?
That's it, by the way.
What do you think the risk of inflation is from a resumption of the bull market in commodities that we saw last year as countries like China, India, Brazil, and many other countries resume high levels of growth, particularly in the industrial sector, that will lead to more demand for commodities like oil, iron ore, metallurgical coal, and copper?
Okay. I think there's two different questions there. One is the question of overall inflation, which I see not at all on the horizon. Wages are stagnant or falling for lots of people. Rents and owner-occupied rents, which are actually together about something like 30 or 40% of the consumer price index, are falling now for the first time on record. So broadly speaking, the picture is of disinflation, maybe even deflation. But commodities almost certainly have a long, so this is, stuff like oil and copper, they have almost certainly a long-term upward trend because it's a finite world and there are new big players in it. I think it's kind of amazing, actually. I didn't look at the end of the day, but at some point today, oil broke $80 again. That's amazing. This is still a quite depressed world economy, and yet oil is back, not up to 140 where it was on the eve of the crisis, but at pretty high levels. And that wasn't. There is some speculative element now. Actually, in a way, it's not clear there was in 2008. There are people stockpiling oil in the expectation that the price would go even higher. But still, what we're basically seeing is that there's a lot of demand for oil. Finding new oil is getting harder and harder. This is we probably are heading for a world where oil is more expensive. So the point is that we can live with that, and it's not the same thing as broad-based inflation, but it just is. Yeah, I think a world of expensive commodities is probably the future, which doesn't mean there won't be another setback, but the days of $10 a barrel oil and $1 a gallon gas are not coming back. Which has got a lot of good things to say for it, actually. So, yeah. But again, I really want to say, and that's my last word, the fears of inflation. You really want to go back to the 1930s and you discover that people, particularly policymakers, were terrified of inflation in the early 30s, even as the world was undergoing the worst deflation it had ever experienced. It's not that extreme right now, but these inflation fears are there's no inflation visible in the world. Lots and lots of historical experience tells us that under these conditions it's not going to happen. What I'd say is, this is a time, don't worry about printing money. Don't worry too much about deficits. There will be a time, I'll give you my final, there will be a time when we will need to be conventionally responsible again. There will come a time when we need to rein in the money supply, when we need to tighten our belts fiscally. But I spend a lot of time these days quoting St. Augustine, "O Lord, make me chaste and continent, but not yet." Thanks.